In West Africa, they say, I stand by the protocols already established. And I believe it is very convenient because you don't end up annoying people because you got the order wrong. So let me start by saying how glad I am to be present with you this afternoon. This is an assembly of some of the best minds in Africa, with a sprinkling of other good minds from outside of the continent. And when I was invited to come and share my thoughts with you, I agonized and asked myself what it is that a lawyer can tell to an assembly of engineers. But I was cajoled, and ultimately I succumbed, and here I am to share my thoughts, whatever those thoughts are. But yet there is a sense in which, even from a layman's perspective, one can speak about infrastructure and the role of the consulting engineer. As I travel across Africa, and I do that quite often, it is not lost on me that whether you are in Dakar, in Senegal, there are beautiful roads that are coming up. Whether you are in Bamako, in Mali, or Cotonou in Benin, or here in Uganda, or in Nairobi in Kenya, or in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, or whichever country, there is a sense in which, to the casual observer, dramatic changes are taking place in Africa. If it is not roads described as superhighways or expressways, it is an hydroelectric plant. If it is not a hydroelectric plant, it is a solar farm. If it is not a solar farm, it is some kind of construction that is going on. And to those who are in the business and in the habit of assessing development by those visually very intrusive projects, Africa is rising. But the question is Africa rising at the pace that she ought to rise? And if she is rising, for whom is she rising? And if she is rising, how is she rising? These are questions that sometimes at a forum such as this, in order to be a good guest, you do not want to go into too deep into them, lest you offend and annoy your audience at once. But yet there is wisdom in examining the role not only of the African consulting engineer, but the role of the African professional overall, particularly when we begin to assess ourselves as a continent which on average has been independent, or having regained our independence, the 55 odd countries of Africa, slightly over 62 years ago, if Ghana is the benchmark. There is the tendency, of course, when we talk about Africa, to talk about Africa as if she were homogeneous, with the consequence that we forget that despite our honest desire to create one homogeneous continent, we are diverse and we are divided into 55 odd countries. And that these countries are a reality. And there is a sense, therefore, in which we do not always, as a continent, speak with one voice. That the reality is that the French-speaking African countries find greater affinity with their former colonizer, assuming they left at all. And that when they are doing their infrastructural projects in Dakar in Senegal or in Bamako in Mali, they are much more likely to incline to Paris. We don't want to say this, but I have to say it. That when you are colonized by the Portuguese, you are Mozambican or Angolan or Cape Verdean or Sao Tome and Principe, that you are much more likely to incline to Lisbon. And that we don't want to speak about it because we want to be politically correct, but I am saying it. That if you are colonized by the British, despite you are not wanting to say it, we are much more likely to incline to London, and it will be much more, if we are not careful, if Brexit succeeds, but we don't want to say it. And much more recently, there is greater affinity to China and Beijing because they have the money, but we don't want to say it because we want to be nice. We are saying all these because they have an implication on how the African engineer and indeed the African professional is going to react and to relate to the world. We are quick to talk about globalization, and it is a good thing. Globalization is something that we cannot run away from. But the question is Africa being gobbled in the name of globalization? So we are assembled here today to ask ourselves whether going forward, the consulting engineer is going to be a contributor to the development of Africa. And what is this thing that we describe as development or growth? What is it? Sometimes we do not want to assess it because we want to have that very thin veneer of what is clean and nice, but yet we do not want to scratch below it. Because there is a sense in which Africa, permit me to use this medical term, schizophrenic. So that you have the beauty and glitter of Kampala and Entebbe, of Kinshasa and Nairobi, of Dakar and Bamako, of Cotonou and Rabat, Morocco, of Egypt, but beyond that, where is Africa? Beyond the infrastructure, and it was not lost on me that in the opening remarks, the Vice President very ably and aptly told us how the connectivity exists between infrastructure and other things. But yet, somehow, despite the many infrastructural projects that we have had and continue to have in Africa, there is a sense in which Africa is still not realizing her potential. There is a sense in which Africa is still restless. You may have the beautiful streets. You may have electricity and potable water and solar energy and nanotechnology in Algiers, but there is a sense in which Africa is still restless. Why? As we talk about growth and development and the role of the consulting engineer. There is a sense in which the young African is still restless in Sudan. Why? There is a sense in which the young African is still restless in Cape Town and Johannesburg. Why? There is a sense in which the young African is still restless in Kampala, in Nairobi, and in Dar es Salaam. Why? Beyond infrastructure, what else must we do? There is a sense in which the African consulting engineer is also grumbling because in essence, the African consulting engineer, like the other African professionals, are still left to deal with crumbs. They are not at the dinner table where caviar is eaten. Why? In the name of globalization. When the big infrastructure projects are being undertaken in Africa, whether it's a railway line, I stand to be corrected. But the African consulting engineer plays a peripheral role. When a big road project is coming up anywhere in Africa, whether it's the east or the south, under the guise of what is called international tendering, I want to submit to us that the African consulting engineer is still playing a peripheral role. If it is a new hydroelectric project, we may commission them all we want, but the African engineer is still playing a peripheral role. Unless they enter into some kind of marriage of convenience with some international firm of consulting engineers, they don't get the work that they deserve. Why? These are uncomfortable questions, but I'm suggesting to us that until the day that the African consulting engineer begins to ask uncomfortable questions, our contribution to the growth of the continent will be only that minimal. You know, several years ago as a young man, I observed that we had major telecommunication companies, state-run, almost in every other African country. What we did when we regained independence, we said we are going to run our telephone companies. Several years down the line, most of our telephone companies are dead, and they have been replaced by multinational companies. We may indeed have mobile connectivity, but in Africa, ask yourself, who owns the mobile company? Who owns them?